Hello and welcome. If you are watching this, it means that you have purchased the Digital Art Junkie ink brushes. In this video, we're going to break down how each one of these brushes works so that you can get to creating. Your brush pack will come with over 20 brushes for lining, inking, texture brushes, and even abstract brushes. To insert a paper texture, come up to your Actions panel and under the Add tab, you're going to click Insert a File. Then you're going to locate your paper textures folder and you're going to choose the paper texture that you want to insert. Make sure it covers your entire canvas, and if it doesn't, make adjustments where necessary. Next, you'll come up to your Layers panel and click the N beside the paper texture layer. Then you're going to select either Linear Burn, Color Burn, or Multiply. Now, usually if you're doing this after a piece is already made, the one you choose is just going to depend on whichever one that you think looks best with your piece. But if you're doing this before you get started, my favorite is Linear Burn, and I always choose that one as my go-to. Make sure that all of your artwork goes in layers underneath your paper texture. Now, anything you draw will have the appearance of being drawn on paper. The first brush we're going to start off with is our texture liner. Now, this brush, like many in the pack, is pressure sensitive, which means it's going to have different effects based on how hard you're pressing down with your pencil. As you press down harder with this brush, your line is going to thicken up and it's going to get a lot darker. It'll also become more opaque. When you press down lightly, you can see that the line is very translucent and it's also very textured. Next is the dry Cali brush. This is a rectangular, thick brush, but you're gonna have different effects based on the angle that you're tilting your pencil with this one. So I'll show you what I mean. Watch the difference when I use the edge of the pencil and just bring it straight down versus when I tilt it slightly to the side, like how I would normally run my brush on the screen. You can see that using the edge of the pencil creates a lot thinner of a line, and using the brush like you normally would will create a very thick and bold line. Next up are the mono brushes. So these are brushes that are not pressure sensitive at all, so they will not change in size or opacity or texture based on how hard you press down. That makes them very consistent brushes, so it's perfect if you want to make an outline where the line is the same weight the entire way through. The only difference between these two brushes is that one has a rougher, more bleeding ink appearance, and the other one has a very clean, very smooth line. Next is the chunky tip brush. This is one of my go-to brushes when it comes to lining anything. It's very smooth with tapered edges. It has a lot of stabilization on it, which makes it really easy to trace things. And it does have some slight size variation when it comes to pressure sensitivity, but it's extremely natural. So pressing down a little harder or a lot harder will just give you a very gradual and subtle change in line weight. Next up is the chisel. This is a thick line that is set at an angle. That's why it's called chisel. And that sharp edge is going to give you an interesting effect when it comes to drawing anything on a curve. It'll thicken up when it comes to the curvature of the line. It's a similar effect to, say, using a ankle Sharpie, like a really thick one. And next are our felt liners. So the first one's called furry felt, and you can see it has a pretty rough edge shape, but it's very high in stabilization and has these really beautiful tapered ends, which makes it ideal for clean handmade outlines. Pressing down harder will slightly increase the size of the line, but it'll look extremely natural on this one. The bleeding felt is next, and the difference with this one is that there is some extreme pressure sensitivity here. So when you press down harder, you get a much thicker line. But that roughness and texture of it makes it look very handmade, especially when it is paired with a paper texture. The high texture brush is a semi-translucent brush that is, like the name says, high in texture. This brush has a natural pressure sensitivity, so pressing down harder will only subtly increase the size of the line, and no matter how hard or soft you press down, it's always going to show that texture. And the translucent capabilities of it means that you can layer it on top of itself and you will be able to see the line work underneath it. The high angular brush is one of my favorite brushes from this pack because of its beautiful texture. This brush has a beautiful hand-painted appearance that I think is just lovely when it comes to inking anything. It is pressure sensitive, so pressing down harder will give you a thicker line, but the texture will shine through no matter what. Let's just take one more look at that texture before we move on. Oh, lovely. Next are our ink brushes. So starting with the fine inky, this one gives an almost drying appearance when you press down lighter, and it darkens up a ton as you increase the pressure of your pencil. I prefer to use this brush at a smaller size because I think it gives off a better appearance of like a drying Sharpie, but totally up to personal preference. Next is just our basic ink brush, and this has some really interesting pressure sensitivities. So the lighter we press down with this one, the more the ink seems to dry. So I like to do it at the beginning and the end of a line. And I'm gonna press down really lightly here, and you're gonna see a lot of variation in the dryness of that ink, which can make it look really, really natural and a little bit less predictable. As you press down harder, you will see the line becomes a lot thicker, a lot bolder, but there's still a little bit of brushwork on there that makes it look really natural and realistic. Like I mentioned earlier, my favorite way to use this is to press really lightly towards the beginning and end of the line so that you get a dried, tapered look. So the ink accent brushes are really interesting. The first one is going to have a spraying effect that leaves some ink stains like on the edge of your brushes. The lighter you press down, the more it gets like a spraying effect, and as you press down harder, it starts to add a little bit more ink to the line and then become totally dark. You can use this brush like a stamp by just pressing down really, really lightly and it'll give you kind of a splotchy stamp look. Or you can just use it in quick, sharp strokes to get some interesting accent looks. I like to use the second accent brush in sharp strokes as well. This brush is also pressure sensitive, so the lighter you press down, the more streaky and the lighter it is, and as you press down harder, the bolder the line becomes. The gel tip brush is another great go-to outline brush because of its tapered edge and its really smooth appearance. But I will say it has a little bit less stabilization because this one is meant to look more handmade, like a real gel tip pen. The buttery brush is a smooth liner that has some definite changes in pressure sensitivity. So the lighter you press down, the more textured and translucent of an appearance you get. And as you press down harder, you get a bolder, darker line. The texture on this one is similar to like an oil pastel. It looks a little bit rough around the edges, but it moves really smoothly. The ballpoint pen is meant to look exactly like an old pen. It's got a really rough texture to it, it's very thin, and it has minimal to no stabilization on it. A great brush for any sort of stippling work or any drawings that you would make with a regular ballpoint pen. The dry erase brush is next, and this one really gives off the appearance that you are drawing on a whiteboard. As you press down lightly, you get a really almost wet look to the brush, and as you press down harder, it becomes darker. You can really see those wet edges when you run the brush over itself, and this is why it's named the dry erase marker, because it really looks like you're drawing on a whiteboard. The abstract brushes are next, and the first abstract brush is so cool to me. Pressing down lightly will give you a thinner and lighter line, and you can actually max this brush out in size by pressing down hard, so the pressure sensitivity here is pretty intense. Also, here's a little trick that you can do with this. I seriously love this brush so much, but one thing I like to do is if I draw a white circle on this white background and then create a clipping mask on top of it, you can get this super cool abstract effect with very minimal effort. The second abstract liner is really interesting to me, and I think you can get some pretty cool effects from it. It works similarly to the other mono brushes, so it is not pressure sensitive, but it has a very interesting shape and texture to it. And now you are ready to start creating. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for your order. Your support means everything to me, and I appreciate it so much. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram and TikTok if you want more tutorials on how to use your brushes.